Good evening, everyone. This is Rebecca Smith-Aldridge, the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. Thank you for joining us this evening for our 2020 Advanced Trustee Workshop, which is 7 Habits of Highly Effective Boards. This is a topic that's based on the Helping All Trustees Succeed curriculum, which has been provided by the Public Library System Directors Organization of New York State, and we are pleased to present it here to you. We, of course, have customized it for our Mid-Hudson crew that's on the line with us here tonight. So I think you'll be benefiting from the hard-won knowledge of close to 30 collective years of experience between your presenters this evening, which are myself and Casey, who you just heard from a brief second ago there. So for myself, if I haven't had the opportunity to meet you yet, I've worked for the Mid-Hudson Library System for just over 21 years. Most of my career here at Mid-Hudson has been in the capacity as a public library consultant. And I see many familiar names on the list tonight of attendees, of boards I've worked with, trustees I've consulted with. We've done great work together over the years, from building buildings to hiring directors to figuring out thorny issues around library funding, winning votes, all sorts of amazing things. So I have the privilege of attending a lot of member library board meetings, and possibly hold the world record for the most library board meetings ever attended. But that's not my claim to fame. I think that that's actually one of my favorite parts of my job, is working with library boards and seeing the dynamics of groups of people who come together to volunteer their time because they really believe in the library as an organization, and helping those volunteers succeed is one of my favorite things to do. So I hope some of the tips we're able to give you here tonight are helpful to you. I think the other thing I wanted to point out is that I am the co-author of the Trustee Handbook. So we've gotten a lot of help and assistance from library boards from around the state in writing that handbook, which means we've gotten to see literally how hundreds, if not thousands, of trustees do things across the state, which I think enhances our understanding of what works and what doesn't. And I'm so pleased to be joined tonight by Casey Conlon, who is our library sustainability coordinator. And many of you may not have met Casey yet, but I hope you've heard his voice or you've gotten help from him on email. Casey, before he came to work at the Mid-Hudson Library System, was a member library director at the Pauling Free Library, and also has experience as an assistant director at the largest library in our system, the Poughkeepsie Public Library District, as well as a library over in our neighboring library system, the Ramapo-Catskill Library System. So between the two of us, we spend probably more time than most thinking about library boards and understanding what works, and observing things crash and burn sometimes, and seeing how library boards recover from that. So we hope you'll benefit from our hard-won knowledge and the hard-won knowledge of many of the trustees that we work for and work with here this evening. Our goal here tonight is to run through 7 habits, as we said, of highly effective boards. We have the habits at the macro level, and then we have some tips for you underneath each of those habits. And we are privileged enough to have 3 very experienced board presidents who have lent their insights and advice for you tonight. So you'll be hearing through us the words and advice of 3 very impressive board presidents in our system. Mark Williams from the Stanford Free Library, Gary Spielman from the Kinderhook Memorial Library, and Pat Placona from the Roloff Jansen Community Library. All 3 have been board presidents for quite some time and have achieved amazing things by leading their libraries forward in their role as board president. So we're so pleased they were able to provide some advice for us here tonight that you'll see woven in to the content here tonight. Casey, anything else we want to say before we dive into our content tonight?
No, we'll have some room where we want to hear from folks, or you can participate. We'll have some questions going out to folks, and so you can use the chat box or the question box to play along from home.
All right, great, thank you. And once again, if you have any technical issues throughout the night, either Casey or I should be able to help you. Just give us a hi sign in the chat or questions box, and we'll get you the attention that we can as we present here tonight. So kicking things off, we want to make sure it's clear that this quote, I think, exemplifies our point here, that habits are not a finish line to be crossed. They're a lifestyle to be lived. So these are not necessarily things we're looking to ask you to, check off each year that you're doing, but to help inform and shape your mindset as you serve on the board of trustees of your local library. There's many things that you will come across and be asked to think about while you're on the board, and the attitude you bring to the table is almost as important as your expertise in participating in those conversations. I think the right attitude can make up for areas that you might not feel as confident in, and so that's part of our goal tonight, is to just kind of help you have the right mindset or kind of mind frame to do work on the library board and be successful at that, regardless of your number of years on the board or your personal background or experience that you bring to the table. I think every trustee at one point or another realizes no one taught them how to be a trustee, and you're not born knowing how to be a trustee. So sometimes you just have to wing it and do your best. But there's an awful lot of support out there to help you do that. And so some of the things we'll talk about tonight are best practices or examples for you, or where to find more information, or maybe a process that your board might want to put in play to help prepare your board and strengthen your board for what's to come in the future. Our first habit for you tonight, I think, is the number one habit, which is having that mindset of accountability and transparency. And that will get you through a lot of those rough times on your board when maybe you have a hard decision to make, or a tough financial issue you're dealing with, or a very large project that you want to pull off. You rarely will have all the answers in the very moment that you wish you did, but how you conduct the business of the board, how you yourself communicate in those very challenging moments, can make or break the outcome of those challenging things that you might be confronted with. And I can see the list of people on the call here tonight. I know most of you have come to our other webinars that we've been doing this year, or have been to workshops we've done in the past. And you know this is a frequent topic of conversation for us. And a lot of that is because one of your, I think, biggest callings is to protect the public trust in the institution and make sure people understand that you have good intentions, that the whole board has really good intentions. And making those as clear as possible is so important and can save the day again and again. You might be faced with very controversial things. You might have a challenge to something that's on the shelf in the library. You could have a disgruntled staff member who has bypassed the director and come to the board, which can cause all sorts of problems for the organization. You might have a very unhappy patron that shows up at a board meeting and wants to yell at you. All of these things could be very upsetting unless you go in with the confidence to understand that you have good intent, as do your peers on the board, and that even if you don't have the answer right in that moment, you're going to figure it out. But it's important to be done in a transparent way. So because this is the advanced trustee workshop and not trustee essentials, I'm actually going to jump right into asking you some questions to see if you're on the right path here when it comes to accountability and transparency. And Casey's going to help me with this section. We've got little mini case studies for you again, and we'll ask that you put your answers to the multiple choice question into the chat box, and we'll see if people are getting steered in the right direction or not, considering where you sit here today.
All right, so in our first case study, consider this. The director lets the board president know that the state now requires a new policy that must be board approved before the next regularly scheduled board meeting. A draft policy is ready for board review. What should the board president's first step be? And you have some choices here that you can read over, and when you've made your selection, you can pop it in the question box, and then we'll review the answer. I have a vote for C. Got a lot of C's here, a lot of C's coming in. I don't see anything else. I got one choice of D and a lot of C's. A lot of people think that they should convene a special board meeting with 72 hours notice and hold an open meeting to approve the policy.
All right, cool. So C is the right answer. So crowdsourcing that one worked very well for everyone. But I could see why someone might say D, because you would, of course, want to be able to read that policy before you get to the board meeting to make sure you're informed for the discussion. But C is the right answer. You are able to call special meetings of the board and have that discussion in a public setting, even if it wasn't on the schedule 12 months ago. So I think one of the fallacies around board meetings is that we often think that that we're locked into the schedule that was approved in perhaps in January, which is certainly not the case. You can reschedule as necessary with the board's agreement. You can also perhaps do so depending on what your bylaws allow for, with the executive committee calling for that meeting. And the recommendation from the Committee on Open Government is that you give 72 hours notice. So I've often seen boards that, they call a meeting for that day or the next day, and sometimes that's not fair to your peers on the board who are busy and have lots going on. And even for those that don't have a lot going on, it might not be enough time to prepare for that discussion that day. So that's a good rule, 72 hours notice to hold that open meeting to approve that policy. So nice work, everyone. Here's our next one.
All right, we'll see if y'all can get this one. The board needs to annually approve staff salaries each fiscal year. How should this be done? And there are a number of choices again that you can choose from, and you can feel free to pop it in the questions box if you don't see the chat box. That's totally fine. We can see the questions box over here. I have one person replied C already right out of the gate. The board goes into executive session at their next meeting to discuss and approve the salary chart. We have a couple of D's, a couple of C's. It looks like the D's might be overwhelming the C's at this point. Oh. So this is an item of new business at the next regularly scheduled meeting, and the board votes on the chart in open session, or the board goes into executive session at their next open meeting to discuss and approve the salary chart. The group is split at this point with the answers.
All right, and that's understandable because you might have a combination of the two, but I would say that D is the ultimate right answer, and that is because it should not be private information what staff are making at your library. You're paying your staff with public dollars, so that's public information of how much the staff is paid. The answer C, if you put in a little asterisk next to that, you might go into executive session if you were talking about the salary of a specific person on the staff as it relates to their performance appraisal. So if you were going to be discussing sensitive information that could harm the reputation of a staff person, then yes, you could use executive session. But even in that case where perhaps there was going to be a salary change made for someone, you would still want to do that in the open meeting setting. So you might go in to have a discussion about a performance appraisal issue the director has brought to your attention, or perhaps it's the director themselves that you're doing their annual performance appraisal on, and the board comes to consensus in the executive session that they're going to increase the director's salary for the coming year. You would still come out of executive session to have that vote on that item. So I do see a lot of kind of skittishness around salary information, but I think it's a good thing to remember that for most libraries, particularly in our system, over 85 to 90% of your funding comes from public dollars. So that should be very open and clear to people what the salaries are for the staff. All right, great. So here's your next one.
All right, y'all are doing great. The library board votes at their June meeting to go out for a major funding increase in November. They learn that this will coincide with the school bus referendum for the school district, a major fundraiser for a local church's capital campaign, and a controversial town referendum on the recreation park. What should the board do? We have a number of options here below, and you can feel free to choose whichever one that you think is the best course of action for the library board. We have a couple people who've chimed in with C. The trustees go on a listening tour around town to assess the library's chances. One team goes to school board meetings, another to town board meetings, and reports back to the board. The board president calls key stakeholders to get the feedback on how the library's funding increase may be received, reconvene to discuss what to do. So we have a D. We also have a number of C's and a B, but C seems to be winning it out here.
I want to give Kevin a shout out for going for D. I think showing your true chaotic evil side is very brave. So the answer is C, that you want to maybe reassess what's going on in town and get out there and listen to what the vibe is, right? Because depending on the financial environment that you're dealing with or the size of your town, this could be fine, right? There, you could have no problem. Maybe the school district does this all the time, or they have a great reputation and they haven't done this in a long time. They've got full support. Maybe there's not a massive portion of the population engaged with the local church's capital campaign. And maybe the town referendum on the recreation park isn't financial, and maybe that's not a big deal, but you'd want to take the time and get a read on the pulse of how the community is starting to feel about that. And you can certainly assume or rely on your fellow trustees to report on what they think is going on. But I think being visible and in touch with what's going on and listening very much so demonstrates that kind of due diligence that you'll want to take before putting the library out there. Because I think when you put the library out for a major funding increase, that's always a risky thing. And you want to go into that being as certain as possible that you're going to have the number of yes votes to win. So you could just, blindly continue on as planned and hope for the best. Sometimes that works out. Sure, we've all been there in our lives. Canceling the library vote right away, I think that's certainly on the table, but I think you want to take a beat and research some stuff, and let's find out if that's truly the right thing to do in this moment. You might find out through that listening tour that, yep, this is not going to be a happy year for taxpayers in our town. They're very upset. And when you get to that pitchfork tipping point moment, sometimes it's best to pull back on what the library's plans were or reduce the amount you're going to be asking for, particularly if you're getting the ear of some key stakeholders in town who are willing to give it to you straight and let you know that it's just probably not going to fly this year, and maybe you want to regroup for next year. So again, it's kind of about the idea that you need to listen, and we can't do that when we only sit at the board table and talk to each other. We'll talk a little bit more about this issue when we talk about another habit related to board development and who's on the board and how well connected they are. But I think always taking an extra meeting or two to reconsider something big like that, when all of a sudden you realize there might be a convergence going on, there's nothing wrong with that as long as the bureaucratic timeline allows for that. So nice job, everyone. So this was our first habit here, accountability and transparency. And I love who is in this meeting today, because I feel like many of you on this call tonight could give this workshop yourselves from your own experiences on the library board and the tone that's set by so many of the board presidents on the line tonight. But I think accountability and transparency, it's that habit you really want to practice all the time. And they say it takes 30 days to get a habit to settle in, and there's all sorts of great books out there about habit setting. But this is something that has to be practiced at every single board meeting, between every single board meeting, during conversations between two trustees, conversations between a trustee and the director. This is something that should be always center of mind when you're dealing with something that's related to library business, library finances, policies that impact staff. These are the kinds of things that a misstep can really cause a significant PR problem or reputation problem for the library, or erode trust in the institution or the board itself. And that's the type of thing that is very hard to recover from and can be a major barrier on the path to accomplishing other things that are on the library board's wish list to do over the course of their strategic plan. So we're on to our second habit of the night, which is a really big one, which is shared vision and goals. And this is the one that I think that not enough boards, I'll just say it, not enough boards spend the right amount of time focused on. Sometimes we assume all trustees are on the same page, or that the board and the staff are all going in the same direction, or we get on the board and we take a look at the long range plan and we all think that everyone else has read the long range plan. And sometimes that's not the case either. So having a shared vision and shared goals are really what makes for a very effective library. When we take a look at some of the most successful libraries in the Mid-Hudson library system, and you start to really analyze how they got to where they got, whether it was building a new building, or hiring a wonderful director, or passing a building referendum, or taking a look at our 414 libraries that are being very successful by going frequently, you'll see that there was a process in which the board reached consensus with not just themselves, but involving the staff and the community in decision making to go where they wanted to go. Sometimes they're iterating on that vision along the way, but the first steps they're taking really were because people came together and agreed on where we needed to go. So our little kind of cartoony graphic here, from boards that just kind of wander around and there's no cohesive vision, and we just go through the motions of meeting every month, and sometimes we'll get a win, and oh, isn't that wonderful? But there's not really a chance to have the experience of having everyone come together and have the idea that we're going to go in the same direction, and okay, then how do we get there? And getting very methodical about what that's going to look like. So the imposed vision model of this is when someone just comes on from on high, whether it's a board president or a committee chair or the director, and says, we're going over here, folks, and here we go. And every meeting is just kind of like dragging everyone along. And other members of the board are, some of them are like, yeah, I think I get why we're doing that. Or others are like, I'm not that interested in that. I'm going to work on this project over here. And then you've got other people who are not paying attention at all and didn't even realize there was a project to work on. That's always fun. But then you've got that no vision at all with people wandering around and doing their own thing. So the work that it might take to get everyone to that third ideal state of a shared vision is really worth the time. And for those of you who have gone through a planning process, perhaps with me helping you or even doing it on your own, I'll share with you that over the course of my career in helping libraries develop strategic plans and long-range plans, or even short-term plans on a faster cycle, all of them at the beginning moan and groan. They tell me, Rebecca, that's so much work. I can't believe you think we have to do all of this to get this done. And I don't cave on it. I always try to cajole and say, yeah, really, trust me, just get this part done and it'll go much smoother. And 100% of the boards that I work with at the end of the day have reported, yep, it was worth the time. I'm so glad we took the time to talk to the community or have a focus group with the staff or make sure all board members participated in this process. Because it's very fulfilling when you start to see, the light bulbs go off and everyone starts to understand why we need to work on something or how we're going to get there, and actually see that unfold, and more people in your organization working to identify the steps it's going to take, the tasks that it's going to take to actually get those steps to move from one stage to another. That's the kind of work that pays off so much for your library at the end of the day. So I wanted to introduce this levels of thought construct to you. This is something that I was introduced to about 12 years ago when I was starting to work on building projects. And it was brought to my attention by a construction management firm who was starting to do things very differently than most construction management firms, who arrive after their architectural plans have been drawn, bids have gone out, and traditionally then a construction management firm comes in and tries to make it all go smoothly. And this guy I was working with, Victor Kansenko down in Long Island, was saying to me, what if we all actually agreed on what we were doing first? Like, all the players it was going to take to build this building were part of it from the beginning, and they all understood where we were going. And then when we hit the rough spots, it goes a lot smoother because everyone was there at the beginning and understood why we were doing what we were doing. And it sounds so simple, but it's true. I've seen it happen again and again, where a board will get very excited about a project, whether it be large or small. Sometimes it's a very small project and people get super excited and they jump right in and they want to start designing that project. They want to start figuring out what color. They want to figure out how to write the invitation. They want to figure out what they're going to serve at the event, whatever it might be. They want to jump right to that design concept in this process, when we really need to take a few steps back and agree that we understand why we're doing this and what our guiding principles are, and philosophically what success is going to look like before you ever jump into design. And that conversation, which could be short or long, depending on if it's a big or small project, will save you eons of time later on down the road. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this play out, particularly with construction projects, where you get into designing with your architect before the board and staff have ever come to consensus about the goals of the project. So taking that time to talk to one another, what's your vision? What does this look like when it comes to fruition? And seeing where those commonalities are and building on that for a successful project, that's when you find the very strong project projects that when you're challenged by an architect or a design professional, or maybe you're in a smaller project setting where a committee is working on something, maybe an event for the community, and all of a sudden you realize there's competing, if not misaligned priorities. So this whole idea of taking that step back before we start coming up with strategy and design and really making sure we're all on the same page to start with can make things go much, much smoother. Many of you have heard us talk about the idea of starting with why, and this is the same idea, where we're actually going to all agree on why we're doing what we're doing, which is going to be strengthened every step of the way along a project or a plan that we have at the library. Even when you're talking about the library's long-range plan or strategic plan, which Casey's going to touch on a little later this evening, if we haven't done the work for everyone to agree on why we've chosen the goals that we have, when it comes time to work on those goals, maybe 6, 9, 18 months later, you're going to have a lack of cohesion in the work that you're going to need to be successful, so that it's not a real grind while you're doing the work. So one of the tips you're going to see later from Pat Falcone or from the Rojan Library is that you want to make sure your time on the board is fun, and you also want it to be fulfilling. And this is the kind of thinking and work that done up front makes sure you're having fun and accomplishing fulfilling things on the other end of stuff. So core values are always great whys, right? When you think about why your board works on something, we know lots of boards over the past 7 months, 8 months have worked on digital inclusion projects, trying to find money or grants or equipment to help people in the community that don't have internet connectivity at home for whatever reason, or maybe don't have a laptop at home and are doing homework on smartphones, right? We all understand why we care about that, because we're committed to making sure everyone in the community has equal access and that everyone deserves the right to a quality education. And that's just part of being a quality library, is trying to figure that out for people in the community. But if you haven't had that conversation, you might know that, but a brand new trustee on your board may or may not understand that. They may have been drawn to the board for a different reason. Perhaps their passion project is something completely different. Maybe they're really all about early literacy, and they really believe in the summer reading program, and that's what really motivates them and gets them going on the board. So when you start talking about a digital inclusion project, maybe they're not on board with it, or they don't quite get why it's so critical, or isn't there someone else working on that in the community? So never assume that everyone on the board has the same core value at the center of their heart as you do. So a conversation on a regular basis, maybe you line it up with the review of your long range plan on an annual basis, and just kind of refreshing everyone's understanding of where our values lie and where our vision lies for our library is really important. We're seeing more and more libraries start to adopt not only mission statements, but also vision statements, right? The difference there is a mission statement speaks to the why of why your library exists. I bet you might have language in your mission statement about a commitment to lifelong learning, or making sure everyone in the community has access to education and entertainment. But the vision statement might also be a helpful exercise for your library board. And we've actually put this worksheet in your handout packet for this evening to have a discussion at the board level of what is the desired end state, not only of your library, but of your community. Because when we start talking and thinking bigger, we know what the library would look like if it was successful. And really importantly, what would the community look like if it was successful? And how is our library contributing to that? That can be a very unifying conversation, and perhaps a quicker way to get that to that shared vision and goals idea than going through a 6-month planning process, which may or may not be in your realm of possibility right now, given everything we're dealing with this year. So if you're looking for maybe a lower entry point into this work, this could be a way forward for your board to discuss what is the vision of our organization at this time. And even if you have a vision statement that was created maybe 2 years ago, maybe it's time to revisit it in light of the pandemic and the challenges that communities are currently faced with, and have been kind of laid bare during the pandemic, from food scarcity issues to digital inclusion challenges. It really might be changing the thinking of where we thought we were going 12 months ago compared to where we know we need to go right now. So updating a vision statement, nothing wrong with that. And it can be a unifying experience for a board. So something else to introduce for all of you board presidents on the line, perhaps when you have high board turnover, if you've got a lot of your trustees or maybe a third of your trustees turned over and you've got a lot of new people on the board, this can be another unifying experience to help bring the group together and go forward together in a way that brings everyone to the table and gives them a chance to be heard as they think about what the vision is for the library. So Casey's going to talk here a bit about the fact that it's not just about your vision, right? We talked about the vision of the library's desired state, but also what the community's desired end state is.
So any good long-range plan and any plan that Rebecca has helped you out with in the past involves input from your community. And the new minimum standards, which all public libraries are required to have in place as of January 1st, 2021, actually call for a long range or strategic plan that actually has community input. So one great tool that we found to actually get that kind of input, and some of the libraries on our call here have actually done this process, is to use the tools in the Turning Outward program, which is from the Libraries Transforming Communities Initiative and the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. So in the Turning Outward program, you focus on your community. It sounds a little silly, but we can get bound up in our offices and our buildings, even when we're not in them, even when we're stuck on Zoom, and forget what we're supposed to be focused on. So you can read the questions here. What kind of community do you want to live in? Why is that important to you? How is that different from how you see things now? And what are some of the things that need to happen to create that kind of change? So if you read these questions, which are also in your packet, and you try to answer them, you'll find that it's a little uncomfortable. We don't often answer these kind of questions in a really honest way, or even think about what we want our communities to look like. But the idea in the Turning Outward program and the community conversations that you'll have through these questions and the discussions that you'll generate with people in the community by using these questions is that you get input about what people want their community to look like. And absent from these questions, you'll notice, is the word library. I think that's an important part and something that makes this program really strong. If you go to people, or if you send them a survey, or if you put one out on the circulation desk or send one home with the curbside book pickups and you say, what should the library do? They're going to tell you you should do more programs and have more books. They haven't really thought about that too much. And that's your job as the library board and the library staff, is to actually consider, what does the community want and how can the library actually help the community get there? So Rebecca, if we can go to the next slide. So as part of the cohort program that we're doing at MHLS to help libraries use the Turning Outward tools, we will actually help you plan the conversations and how to have the conversations in your community, how to make sure that you have people show up to the conversations, including this year in 2021, considerations for how to safely conduct a community conversation while reducing the risk of COVID transmission, whether you want to do that through a Zoom or online call, or whether you can push it off, or we can plan to do it for when the conversations, when it'll be nice out, so you can actually do it outside if that is a recommended low risk activity by the local health authorities and the state and the federal government. So we'll help you get started with planning those conversations, with sending out the invitations, with brainstorming who you actually have to invite to these conversations, and then a little bit of nudging and high fives and attaboys and attagirls to make sure that you're actually doing the work to invite all the people to these conversations, and then follow up again too and say, hey, did you get that invitation to your key stakeholders, to make sure that they actually come to the conversation. As a library, you're not talking to people about what the library is doing in these conversations. You're using the questions that we looked at earlier and some other ones to actually facilitate a discussion between community members. So we'll give you practice in actually facilitating those conversations and how to do that the best, to make sure that you hear from everybody and you can manage anything that you are afraid might crop up in that conversation, whether it's bad behaviors or anything like that, or how to make sure somebody's not dominating the conversation. So we'll help you practice those. We'll also help you analyze what you're hearing in the conversation and find themes in those conversations that you can use to actually create your long-range plan. And I want to echo what Rebecca said earlier a little bit. I have faced down writing a long range plan at a library, and it is not an easy task. And it's not something that you can do in 2 or 3 or even 5 hours or at a board meeting. This is not an easy process, but we at Mid Hudson have taken these turning outward tools and we have systemized it and we have spread it out over the course of a reasonable amount of time and built in time for you to do the work so that you can actually move from getting that input to creating your plan. We have templates and we have other exercises that you can do to actually create your plan. And part of this is informed also by the fact that I've actually gone through the Turning Outward training from the Harwood Institute, and I've seen many libraries attend that training and then just kind of fall flat when they go home to their libraries and they say, let's do this, and other people don't get it or they don't have the follow through. So we're going to make sure that you have what you need and provide the support as best we can to make sure that you take the conversations and get to the conversations and move to your long range plan. If you're interested in this, you can go to midhudson.org/turning-outward and you'll actually see a form there where you can sign up and say, hey, I'm interested in this for 2021, and I'll make sure that you get the info for when we start up this program.
Excellent. Thanks, Casey. I see we've had two questions come through that I want to address before we move on to habit number 3. And one was a question that came up during our Q&A, our exercise in the first habit. I believe it was related to when we talked about if you go into executive session or not to discuss staff salaries. And a question came up from Gail of whether or not that applies to free association libraries. And so that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. Association libraries at this stage of development in the Mid-Hudson library system receive a significant portion of their operating aid from the local taxpayers. So again, public money is underwriting those salaries. Where an association library has a different classification is under the Freedom of Information Law, or FOIL. So you might be thinking in that respect, if you were to be foiled, where someone gave you a FOIL request for information at the library, do you have to respond? And your library, even an association library, should have a FOIL policy, because while you're not legally bound to respond to a FOIL request as an association library, there are very limited circumstances in which I would encourage you not to respond to a FOIL request, because the boomerang effect of that is not good, because immediately the person who is disgruntled will start raising questions, and in my experience, quite loudly will start raising those questions of what are you hiding? What's going on over there? Why won't you tell us? And all of a sudden you're going to have a bigger problem on your hand than you would have had you just turned over the information. So association libraries are encouraged to have what's called a FOIL request policy, which does indicate, and we actually have a sample for you on our website for association libraries. It indicates that while you're not legally required to respond, you will do so, and in what manner you will do so, which still leaves you that legal loophole to step out of that response if you had to for a more controversial reason, which we can certainly talk more about. But I think it goes back to habit number 1, right? We want to be accountable and transparent. And the minute people start to think we have something to hide, it causes a lot of smoke, and sometimes that happens even when there's no fire. So that would be my answer on that one. Another question that came up was related to this most recent habit we were speaking about, which was related to vision and having a shared vision, not just with the board, but between the board and the director. And the question from Deborah was, what happens if the director and board don't have a shared vision? What happens then? So that's a real life problem when you've got a divergence of thinking and views and of how we're going to lead the library forward. And I go back to the point about process, that vision shouldn't be created in a vacuum, right? You should be considering multiple viewpoints and hearing from those 3 major stakeholder groups of the board, the director and staff, and the community. And hopefully there's themes that emerge and your vision then speaks to that. But you certainly can have situations in which the director has a very specific view on a particular goal, hopefully not the overall vision for the library, but a particular goal the director may find over time doesn't work anymore, either because it doesn't align with what the community actually needs, it's outdated, or another organization is working on that particular goal, so why are we working on it? But I think there should be an invitation to have a conversation about that. If the director's point is reasonable, the board might want to think about amending the goal and thinking a little bit differently about right sizing it or course correcting it. Sometimes though, you'll have a case where a director and board just aren't getting along for whatever reason. It definitely happens sometimes. And that then, I have to say, at the end of the day, that the board has the ultimate say on what direction, strategic direction, the library is going in. So though before you dismiss the director's idea, I do encourage you to hear them out. They are your eyes and feet on the ground, and they may have some very good points to make about why this might not be the right direction to go in. But again, if there's some kind of personality conflict or behavior or discipline problem with the director, not having the same vision or grinding on goals could be a symptom of a much larger problem that's going on with the director. All right, Casey, did you see any other questions that came through?
We had somebody who noted back when we were talking about the salary question that they they thought that they might have a executive meeting before the approval process, so it would be kind of a two-step process.
Yeah, that could happen if there was some reason to question how much someone, what position salary was. But again, I'd encourage you to have the vote on the actual salary chart in the open meeting setting.
So that's all I see for now for questions.
Excellent, thank you. So our third habit we're going to talk about here tonight is teamwork, because not much happens in a library without teamwork, that's for sure. As we like to say at Mid-Hudson, teamwork makes the dream work. And no one has brought that to life better than Mr. Mark Williams over at the Stanford Free Library, who you see here on a very exciting day in the history of the Stanford Free Library, in which they had their grand opening to their brand new library after years of dedication and hard work and a major capital campaign. You see him standing at the base of their thermometer there with Assembly Member Dee Dee Barrett, who helped them reach their goal. And of course, you can see the look of joy on everyone's face at the day of the groundbreaking ceremony, which logically happened before the grand opening. But you can just see how many people, not only they're lined up in the hard hats, where you see Dee Dee and Mark, their architect, their library director, other trustees, but you see really happy community members around them as well, because it really did literally take a village to bring that project to fruition. And I told Mark that I thought his quote here was t-shirt worthy, because I think this is what really motivates so many of us to work with organizations like libraries, the idea of working with others towards a common goal and figuring out your way around challenges and then finally achieving that goal. It's one of life's more rewarding experiences. And Mark is a very well-spoken gentleman, and I think that comes through here in the quote that he's provided here today. I think all of us can relate to that and understand what that feeling is, that glow that you have when you pull something off with a group of like-minded people. It's a really great and sometimes really life-affirming experience. But how do you actually do it? Where's the practicality in terms of how you make teamwork really go smoothly? And that's where I wanted to share some tips from Pat Placona from the Rojan Community Library up here in Columbia County. Pat has one of the largest library boards in our system, and they are a very dedicated group of people that have to fill in the gaps sometime because their library is still kind of on an evolutionary path when it comes to funding. So a lot of their trustees actually do work in areas like programming because there's not enough paid staff to do everything the community really needs from the library. So this is a really hands-on board that does a phenomenal amount of work and is probably one of the boards that I've seen use committees the most effectively in my 20 years of working at Mid-Hudson. And Pat is just absolutely masterful in keeping everyone connected, finding out what people need, smoothing the way for committees to get their work done. And you see some key tips here from Pat that I think a lot of the board presidents on the line here tonight are really going to appreciate, if not learn from. Understanding who those people are that are sitting next to you at that board table. We're not cookie cutter people, right? We have to understand the personalities and experiences that each trustee brings to the table in order to form effective teams and build on people's skills and experience. And making sure that we're all aware of the issues facing the library, not just the executive committee or the board president and the director, because the more the full board or a full committee understands the challenges, the less friction that you'll have while you're working as a team on a particular issue. Now, Pat, you can see how dedicated she is here. She goes to all of the committee meetings, but this is not to impose her will on the committee. This is to make sure she understands where committees are going, why they might have arrived at a recommendation they did. So she's not there to micromanage, but she wants to support the committee to be successful on behalf of the board. So you can imagine when you look at the textbook description of how committees work in the board setting, this is truly the work that's necessary to make that happen, that you are shepherding the committee's work to the board table and helping the full board understand where a committee is coming from. And as the main facilitator of that work at the board meetings, the board president has a pretty important role to play with that. Now, Pat was very quick to point out how important it is to thank your trustees frequently. Just like you, other people at that table make sacrifices to be there and help out on a regular basis. And sometimes it can feel thankless. That's something we hear from library friends groups a lot, that they feel that they're not acknowledged or thanked often enough. They're not looking for a payment in the form of money. They're looking for payment in the form of gratitude. And so being deliberate about that, Pat pointed out, is very important. And Pat also pointed out the most significant team in your library is the one of consisting of the board president and the library director. If that relationship's not going well, it's very hard for the rest of the board to operate as a team. And that point will be stressed as we move on here in the evening. And her last 2 points here, one being to seek advice, that not all teams will have all the expertise they need to accomplish a task. And so to look around either your board table, your organization, or your community. And of course, over at Mid-Hudson, Casey and I are here to help you find advice from other boards who may have tackled a similar project, or we can help you figure out your way through something. We're certainly here to help you do all that kind of work. And of course, I mentioned her last point here earlier. Working on the board should be fun. I know sometimes you're dealing with very tough issues or very big goals that you may have, but the more effective teams are those that are having fun while they're doing those big things. So always remembering that there's a social aspect to serving on the board. And when it doesn't become fun, that's when you'll see people stop coming to meetings and not follow through on tasks, and eventually, kind of fade away, either just not show up at meetings or really just go ahead and quit on the board. And when you do exit interviews with trustees, that's something that I frequently hear. Well, it wasn't quite as much fun as it used to be, or it just got a little too heavy for me and I just didn't have the time anymore, right? We all have to prioritize where we spend our time. And a place where we're working with people that we enjoy being with and we accomplish great stuff is a great way to keep trustees connected and engaged and motivated in the work of the library. So big thanks to Mark and Pat for their input on this one. In your packet, you've got a handout that should look familiar to you because you also received it at the Trustee Essentials workshop, which just is a reminder of the roles and responsibilities. When you take a look at the role of the library director versus the trustees, and then if you have a friends group, really where their lane is that they're in terms of the work of the library. And we're not going to go through this handout for probably like a third time, given the number of workshops I think many of you on the call tonight have already been to. But I did want to take a moment to stress the whole idea of staying in your lane. And I say that very politely and diplomatically. Just that reminder that boards play that governance role. You're providing oversight to make sure funds are spent responsibly and planning to set that strategic direction to move the institution forward in a meaningful way to make a difference in people's lives in your community. And your director is there to manage. They are your technical advisor to help shape that planning. But then once you've got that set, you unleash them and let them get it done. Get those daily operations of the library humming and carry out the vision of the board through the tools that you've given them to do so, with the budget that's been approved, with the policies that are in play, with strategic decision making done collaboratively between the board and the director. This is really how good things happen when that works well. And so often when Casey and I are called in to help mediate something, or we have a breakdown, sometimes that happens and we get a call from a library director or a library trustee. More times than not, it usually boils down to one side or the other crossing into the other's lane and either micromanaging from the board side, or a director who came in and kind of forgot how to bring everyone along with them with their great ideas. So this is something that comes up a lot for us, and we thought it was worthy of repeating tonight. And it's interesting because you see it echoed through the words of Jerry Nichols, who was the co-author of the Trustee Handbook. He provided a great webinar, which is still available. You can actually go to the state library's website. It's called the Critical Partnership, and it talks about the relationship between the director and the board. And he really brings it to life for people. What does it look like to be effective in this critical partnership as trustees? And we certainly talk to directors all the time about the other side of that equation. But on the board side of things, you'll see a board that's engaged, that respects the institution and the staff, that understands how to work as a collective authority, that delegates as appropriate, that is positive in the work that they do, and that, this one I'm going to take a moment on is to deal appropriately with board misbehavior, not allowing one trustee to dominate a meeting or to not show up and drag down a group who's trying to achieve something, making sure that's nipped in the bud and that the board president has a conversation with a trustee who's not pulling their weight or acting appropriately at their meeting or stepping outside of their role. I think one person misbehaving can ruin the experience for everyone if that's not dealt with well. So obviously a delicate issue, but this is why we encourage you to have a code of ethics in place, and sometimes even a code of behavior in place for more contentious boards to make sure you've got the policy backup to hold people accountable on this topic. And the best piece of advice I ever got about Jerry, which is funny because it's also the piece of advice I got from my mom, is that it's not all about you. It's about the library, right? We're putting the library ahead of ourselves in the decision making that we're doing. So we might have an opinion, we might fight for that opinion, but once consensus is reached, we back off of our personal opinion and move forward with the group so we can all be successful. And much of that work and those conversations happen during board meetings. So Casey's going to walk us through habit number 4 here, which is effective meetings, because this is where you spend the majority of your time as a trustee in many cases.
All right. So yeah, so a lot of your time as a trustee is spent in board meetings, and we want to make sure that you have a couple of tools that might help make the time that you spend together more effective and more enjoyable, and have people get more out of the work that they're actually trying to do for the library. So in the next slide, this is the first thing we want to talk about. If you don't know the name or the term board packet, you are familiar with its components. It includes the agenda for the meeting, which is normally prepared by the board president or the director and the board president working together. And this is going to drive what you actually do and get done in the meeting. The director's report is in there as well, where the director reports to you on the things that are happening at the library, the amazing things that happened in the past month, or anything else that you need to know about the library, and trends that are happening in the library and that you need to be aware of. The treasurer's report, of course, the financial responsibilities of you as a trustee are very important. And so there's many important things to review in here, including the year-to-date spending to make sure that you are on track to not overspend or underspend any budgets. This last item here, the committee reports, you may not be familiar with this, as a lot of the committee meetings and the work in the committees can be reported verbally at the board meeting, but it is best practice to get into habit of actually documenting the work that's being done and the decisions that are being made and the recommendations being made by committees outside of the actual board meetings. So the idea is that you, as the board of trustees or as a trustee, will have all this information ahead of the board meeting and be able to actually read it and review it and process it so that you're ready to ask questions and take action at the board meeting. If you're reading these reports at the meeting, it's not a great use of everyone's time. So it's not necessarily your fault though, because a lot of times what we see is that you have this chain of emails, or you have a bunch of separate emails if they're not on a chain, wherein all the participants in the meeting, all the attendees, are sharing their information with everybody on the board of trustees. And if anybody here, I assume everybody here gets email at least once in a while, you'll know that this isn't a great way to get and process information. So what we recommend is actually that all of these people give their information to the board president, who can compile it into the board packet and distribute it to the board of trustees ahead of the meeting so that you all have a chance to read and process the information, come up with any questions that you might have, and prepare for the meeting so that you can move ahead in an efficient way at the meeting and make good use of the board's time and any library staff's time who is at the meeting. It also has the benefit of making you look really good in case anybody ever shows up to your meeting who isn't a board member or a library staff member. So we had a question. This is, yep, so yeah, we can go to the question. So this is kind of a fun question. When should the board packet be sent to trustees? And so this is not when do you, this is when should. When do you think the packet ought to go out to trustees? Should it go out around lunchtime the day before the meeting, around dinner time, maybe the day of the meeting, 15 minutes before the meeting, or 1 week before the meeting? I see a lot of
Casey, we've
D's in.
got a lot of ringers in the audience tonight.
Okay. All right. So we didn't want to gloss over this effective strategy. We have an if possible here I see in there. But again, the idea is that you all have the opportunity to read and prepare for the meeting. And setting those deadlines for when you're going to get the information out is ideal. It also allows you to post the information to your website so that the public can participate in the meeting. So
So
anyway,
Casey, before you talk about agendas, I just wanted to note there's a question here about the ratio of members to a committee, because you stressed the importance of having committee reports since not all trustees are on those committees. And I'll just point out, that you need to have less than a quorum of your board on any committee. So that's the one kind of formula to keep in mind, that once you have a quorum of the board, it becomes an open business meeting, and then you're into a whole nother realm of responsibility. So less than a quorum is the number of members that should be on a committee. So Casey, I'm sorry to jump in your role there. I just wanted to tackle that one.
No, I appreciate it. That's great. All right, so the other thing, getting back to the agenda drives what we are going to be able to accomplish at the meeting. And so giving people a chance at knowing what's going to happen at the meeting, being respectful of their time, and being prepared to actually participate in the discussion is very important. You'll see just from the way this is laid out, this comes from a recommendation for a agenda template from the Harvard Business Review. You can access the full article at the link you see here in the lower left. But the first item to point out is for an agenda item, you might want to create, instead of just a phrase, which doesn't really define it for anybody who's reading the agenda, what you plan to talk about, is if you pose an actual question. Here I've come up with the hypothetical, how can we recruit more board members and plan for officer succession? And the idea is to, again, give the participants in your meeting, the trustees in this case, an idea of what they're actually expected to talk about. And having a question will also direct your discussion. So there's a time set up on here, which lets participants in the meeting know how long you actually plan to spend on this issue. So if it was a very quick issue, you would know that from the time. It also helps move the meeting along and helps you understand how much time you actually have at the meeting. If you think about it and you time out how much input you want from folks, you might find that the time that you've given isn't enough, and you might not have enough time in your meeting to cover all the things you want to cover. So defining a purpose, whether you're just presenting information or you're just gathering input or you actually want to make a decision, that's something that is really good to define in the agenda. And of course, if there's anybody who's supposed to lead the discussion or you plan on having contribute significantly to the discussion, you might want to let them know. It's always really unfortunate when you show up to a meeting and somebody says, hey, Casey, are you going to talk about all this stuff? And you got like a mouthful of sandwich or something. And you're like, I wish somebody told me that ahead of time. In the second column over here, we have preparation. And so this goes back to, again, people being prepared for the meeting. You could put anything in here that would enable people to help participate in the process and remind them of how to frame the discussion and what you're trying to do with this agenda item. Here we have review current trustee terms. That would be a good one in general. I feel like a lot of us don't always know how long we're serving on the board. And here we have review a chapter on board development from the trustee handbook. So these are the things people are expected to have read and understand before they come to the meeting. And then a proposed process to let people know how you actually plan to come to a decision and address this item. So again, you can read the full write-up of this agenda item in the or how to write a really good agenda at this Harvard Business Review article. It's really helpful, and I think it's really great to run a meeting with these kinds of agendas.
Cool. We'll make sure that link is in your wrap-up email that you get after the workshop tonight.
All right, so then at the meeting and after the meeting, facilitation is important. Ideally, you'll be able to hear from everybody, or at least every relevant person at the meeting. A lot of our boards aren't so big, although I know we have some very big boards, so that we want to get input from a diverse number of people. We want to make sure everybody's heard. That's going to make sure that we have good buy-in for any decisions that are made, and also just make for a stronger decision and a more well-informed decision. The wrap up and follow up / check-in, if anybody knows me or has been to a meeting with me, they know I'm very big on this. So after a meeting, if you've made any decision, especially if you've assigned some kind of work or something that needs to get done, sending an email to everybody who was at the meeting, especially the people who that thing got assigned to, is really helpful just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. If you had a meeting and you think that you agreed that somebody's going to do something, and they are not aware of that, or they are confused about it, and you get to your next meeting and it's not done, that will be unfortunate. So the last part of that is, of course, the follow-up. So the follow-up or check-in, a lot of times I do this 1 week before another regular meeting. If you have a monthly meeting, maybe you set your timer or set your calendar for in 3 weeks, I'm going to send an email out to everybody to remind them about all the stuff that we said we're going to do. That is a real helper for a lot of people. A lot of times a month seems like almost too long to get something done, and so it falls by the wayside. But if you give people that 1 week check-in, you say, hey, remember we said we're going to do this thing, that actually gives them a whole week to get done the thing that they may not have done yet. So I'm a big fan of that if you've been to any meetings, and I think it's super helpful. And you do run the risk, of course, of somebody saying, well, I already did that. I said I was going to do it. But I have very rarely run into that. And those go-getters who have done the work will probably say, yep, I did it already. Thanks very much. So the last part of a good meeting and a good regular practice to get into is the plus delta from the meeting. This is a nice way of saying what was good and what should we keep from the meeting, and delta means change, of course. What should we change from the meeting? So if you get into maybe not necessarily every board meeting, but you certainly could, or at a regular interval, looking at what worked from the meeting and what didn't. Maybe it's, hey, all those key things Casey said at that thing were really great. I'm so glad we started doing them. They totally help us move forward and act as a more effective board. That's great. But if there's things that aren't working out for people, you're going to want to hear about that so that you can make some changes, so that you can do the best work that you are capable of doing, and so that you can actually move forward as a board. So those are some of the tips that we had. If there's any other input that you have, Rebecca, we can hear that. Otherwise, we can move on.
I just want to point out that the plus delta exercise is way more helpful than you might think. And it's a little funny story about that. When we first had the shutdown orders for the pandemic, and our whole staff at Mid-Hudson had to go work from home, and some of them had never worked remotely before. That was a huge change for people. And I had a meeting with Casey and another one of our colleagues, Lori Shedrick, who many of you know, and we got through the whole meeting, and I just checked in with them, and I'm like, was this working? How did this go for you? And Lori said, it'd be really helpful if you turned your screen on next time. And that was a great learning to me, that I'm looking at my screen. I think everyone else is too, but I had actually forgotten to turn on the software so that Casey and Lori was looking at what I was referring to. So little things like that can get fixed, and sometimes big things can get fixed too, which you'll be thankful for in the long run, instead of waiting until an annual evaluation to point out, like, well, Mary, who always runs that committee, she always does blah, blah, blah. Well, we could have addressed that months ago had we discussed it, rather than us all suffered through 6 more committee meetings where it wasn't going well. So thank you, Casey, for including that in this section. So our next habit is deliberate board development. This is our 5th habit. And this is something that is a personal goal of mine to help libraries with, and it's something I've been working on with our own Mid-Hudson Library System Board of Trustees. As many of you know, while I've worked at Mid-Hudson for over 20 years, I've only been the executive director for about 2 years. And so this year's been a lot of fun. But one of the things I take a hard look at is making sure Mid-Hudson is modeling all of these best practices. And our board that's been doing a great job on most of this. But I'll point out that our board recognized that they were not doing a self-evaluation of themselves, and that's something they're now designing and working on. So we just wanted to point out there's really 4 components to deliberate board development. And so you might think to yourself, board development, what the heck is that? Or, well, recruitment, well, I do that when I find someone who I like or has a pulse to come serve on the board with me. And what we want is for us to all be more deliberate about board development. And that's the whole life cycle of someone's service on the library board, from evaluation of the current experience by the trustees who are on the board now. And we've actually got a tool for you in the handout I'm going to point out in a minute, to regular education, whether it be attending workshops like this, done by Mid-Hudson or the State Library or the trustee section of the New York Library Association, or United from Libraries from the American Library Association. There's all sorts of groups that are offering formal education out there, but also sometimes building it in at the local level to have maybe at Mid-Hudson, we actually reserve 10 minutes of every board meeting to take a deeper dive on a topic that one of our committees designs for us. So instead of assuming everyone knows something, sometimes we'll take a deeper dive on a topic, whether it be a particular revenue source or a relationship with another organization or a broader topic like broadband connectivity. Sometimes even those 10 minutes at a board meeting can really enhance trustees' understanding of an issue and why you're dealing with policy issues related to it. But I think also formal sessions like the ones we offer here at Mid-Hudson, not that we're biased, also can really help out trustees who might be newer to the work or want to take a deeper dive on something. It can enhance the experience for everyone on the board when education is made a priority. We actually have a growing number of library boards who have written in education requirements into the bylaws for trustees, where they're requiring new trustees to come to the Trustee Essentials workshop at Mid-Hudson within the first year of service. So taking that very seriously and maybe even taking that next step to formalize it could really up the game of your board. Recruitment, we're going to talk about in a minute as well, so I'm not going to spend that time on it here, but we're also going to talk about orientation tonight, because this is something that I know I need to work more on at the Mid-Hudson Library Board, System Board, but I always think of it as the giving people a fighting chance. When you think about the first time you came to a library board meeting when you started to serve on the board, did they slow down and stop and introduce everything to you? Did you get a introduction to the entire organization before you began to serve so you understood the context of conversations? If you did, I'm high-fiving your director. That's wonderful. I'm so glad that happened for you. But a really large number of trustees did not have that experience, and it will cause a problem at interesting times. Sometimes you'll have a trustee who raises their hand and they just flat out admit something like, look, I've never known what that acronym means, and now it's a problem. I need to understand what that is. And these are the kinds of things that if we had given people a basic level of understanding, their experience would be better and the work product would probably be better too. So in your packet, I gave you a sample evaluation form. You could use it straight or you could customize it for your board. But if you'll recall back when we talked about trustee essentials, we talked about, of course, you need to do a performance appraisal on your director. But because you co-lead the library with your director, you also have to do a self-evaluation for the board as well to get that rounded opinion and understanding of why things are working the way they are, or maybe why things aren't working the way they are. It's a good exercise, and as I said, one that our own board at the system is prioritizing to get done in the next year to enhance their work. This is something that I think needs to be best practice or routine practice for every board out there, whether you're an association library board or a public library board that has public elections, which is, again, deliberate board development, taking a look at who's currently on the board, who do they represent, and who might be missing in representation on your board. When you think about who lives in your community, whether they live in a particular geography of your service area, whether they're representing a particular lifestyle, families, or are they a particular age or ethnicity? All of these things are ingredients to the board makeup that you have. And every once in a while, we'll come across a board that hasn't done this work, and then they go to do something very large, like a 414 vote for an association library, or maybe a capital campaign or a building referendum. And all of a sudden, they realize they don't have the connections they need to all aspects of their community. So when we think about how we recruit people and who we approach to join the board or run for election for the board, this is a tool that might be helpful to you to kind of do this assessment formally. You might think, I've got this in my head, I kind of know, but actually taking the time to do the work and put the check marks in the document could perhaps be revealing. And I gave you a sample in the handout packet tonight that's a little even better than the one you see on the screen here tonight. But I encourage you to customize it for your community. I was thinking about some of our libraries who serve multiple towns, and what is the breakdown of who serves on the board as it relates to those 3 towns. That can be a make or break decision when it comes to going out for funding across the 3 towns. So these are just one little handy tool for you that I think we should see more library boards using in the future. I also want to share with you a really, I think, well thought out process from the Patterson Library down in Putnam County. They actually use a trustee application, and a lot of you are tonight from association library boards, and you might think to yourself, oh, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah, let's have people apply to be on the board. For those of you that have board elections that are public libraries with a public election of your trustees, you may think you can't do this because they have to get a petition to get nominated to be elected, but you can use a modified version of this process to enhance the candidates that you have running for the library board. And I just point this out to you because I think the seriousness of coming and committing your time to the board, that should be a message that's sent from day one. And some of you might think like, oh, we don't want to scare off anybody. We don't want them to know what it's really like. But you're really starting a relationship in which you might be spending a lot of time together. So Casey recently interviewed the director of this library to understand how this process is being used. And they pointed out that they don't get a lot of cold calls, shall we say, where someone just randomly fills this out and sends it in. Usually they use it with someone who the board is cultivating to join the board, where they've identified a community member who seems like they would be a good fit. And here's the next step to formalize that and bring that into the nominations and elections committee. But it helps a person who wants to run for the board think through, are they a good fit? And it also helps the board think through, do we really know this person we're inviting to join our group? Because the group dynamics can be greatly thrown off by someone who may not be a good fit. So we don't want this to become an insiders club either, where you only get on the board if you know somebody, right? So this makes it a more transparent process, like we talked about in habit number 1. And so we gave you the entire package the Patterson Library uses in your handout packet. If that's something that you think might help formalize or organize your process for board recruitment. Now, orientation topics, as I mentioned, this is something I'm thinking a lot about now because we're designing some new orientation processes for the system board at Mid-Hudson. There's actually a chapter in the trustee handbook about orientation, which we actually went ahead and put in your handout packet tonight because it's not something where you have to reinvent the wheel. Most libraries have the same categories that trustees need to understand, and there's a roadmap for you right there for how to do orientation for new trustees. And if this is something that your library hasn't maybe ever done, maybe you start by doing it for everyone on the board, and then you just offer it as new trustees come onto the board as you have turnover on the board. But you might be surprised where the gaps in knowledge are for people who've been on the board for multiple years, where they might not want to admit they don't know something, or they didn't even know what they didn't know. So this might be an interesting exercise to consider when you think about getting a well-rounded board development process in place. So our next habit here, Casey's going to take us through, which is the ambassador mindset.
Okay, so I hope everybody is sitting down. So not everyone in your community knows about all the great things that are going on at the library. Not everybody at your local boards and in your local organizations knows, and not everybody in the state legislature knows. And they really should know. Your libraries are doing virtual story times in the midst of COVID so that children can still practice their early literacy skills, even though they can't necessarily come to the library. People are coming to the library and sitting in the parking lot or checking out actual hotspot devices to bring home so that they can continue their education and continue their work despite not having great broadband connectivity. The downloadable content available is huge compared to what it was before COVID, and libraries are stepping up to address issues like food scarcity and even just wellness calls at this point. All of this stuff is going on now, but a lot of people don't understand it and don't understand what's happening at the library. But fortunately, we have a bunch of trustees who work at every library, who volunteer at every library, and they actually have many connections in their community, and they are engaged with many of the people in their community. So anybody who's on the board, even if you don't get a follow-up email from the board president or the director saying that you have a task before the next meeting, all has work to do. Everybody has work to do after the actual meeting ends. You need to be sharing with people in your community the great work that the library is doing, both so that they can benefit from it. There are likely things that they can take advantage of that they don't realize, and also to build the goodwill in your library that can be converted into other kinds of support, whether it's support financially or support in the form of time. We all have connections and we all have relationships with people. Whether you're meeting people in person to have a safe, masked, socially distanced walk or socially distanced shopping or mass shopping experience, you are interacting with people and you have an opportunity to let them know about what's going on in the library. Social media is obviously one of the safer ways and one of the ways that people are turning to increasingly to engage with one another. The telephone has also made a huge comeback, as we've seen some of our libraries using it in wellness calls, but I think people are talking on the phone more than they have in a very long time as a result of COVID, because this is a safe way to connect with their loved ones and their friends. And finally, I just wanted to point out that many of the people that are on the call today, many of the trustees, are some of the most connected people in the community. And so if you are a member of a Rotary Club or a Board of Ed or a Chamber of Commerce, whether you're meeting in person, which you're likely not doing now, or if you're doing so safely outside, or whether you're having Zoom meetings with that group, sharing what the library is doing and listening to hear what the library can do to actually benefit that organization is going to be a huge benefit to both organizations. So you sort of always have to be on the lookout for opportunities the libraries can help people and share that with your friends and your connections who you have in the community. One of the best ways to actually have people remember what the important work the library is doing is to share stories that you find. We have a couple stories here. The first one is from the Phoenicia Library. They're great at getting and sharing stories over there in Phoenicia. And we have Robert Burke Warren, who's a local musician, says, "My library, the Phoenicia Library, is the unofficial pickle barrel, the community center where folks not only seek out books, DVDs, and knowledge via classes and the internet, they also gather to chat and commiserate. Some hashtag library love." So this is before COVID, when people could safely gather to chat and commiserate. But looking out for this story and sharing this story shows the importance that the library plays for this person and for other people in the community. On the right side, we have one of the Hudson Library Summer Reading Program participants. This was a text message that said, "Poppy just said this is one of the best days of her life after getting the backpack and the books." The Hudson Library have partnered with a couple local organizations to share backpacks that had literacy materials and masks and some nature exploring materials. And this was the best day of this girl's life. Admittedly, she's not super old, like if I said this is the best day of my life, I got a lot more years on this girl. But this kind of story is the kind of thing that you want to be able to tell to legislators and to other key stakeholders in your community. And the stories that you can tell are actually going to help people remember the good work that the library is doing more and help them share that more. Stories like this actually invoke a very empathetic part of our brain where we put ourselves in that situation and we think about it more. So looking out for those stories and then sharing those stories is a very important part of being an ambassador and building up that goodwill in your community. So we want to take a break here and do another little game. We want to hear about who is the most connected person or organization in your community. So you can use the question box and you can identify who is the best person to talk to in your community or share information with if you want to make sure everybody knows about it. A lot of us have these people in the community where we can make sure that if they get the information, we know that they're going to share it with a ton of people, whether it's online or in person, because they are super connected. Sometimes it's a mayor, or sometimes it is a PTA president. These people naturally find themselves in leadership roles.
Cool. We're seeing PTA came in right away, a pastor in the community, a town supervisor, the Chamber of Commerce, our Grange president, school administrators, the mayor, a local blogger. It's actually a whole group, Mayapack Moms on Facebook, the pharmacist. These are some great tips here. And someone admits they don't have a clue. I love that.
Okay.
Uh, a lot of town supervisors are on the list. And
Okay.
someone said someone very maybe informal, a neighbor who knows everything.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an official, an official person who holds an official office. Sometimes these folks, through their natural connectivity, they'll actually be able to, find their way into these positions of leadership or recognition in the community. But, they could just be somebody who's super well connected in the community. That's just how they are, and they don't need a reason to serve in any kind of office. So when you think about this person or this group, just keep in mind the kind of information that they're looking for and what their priorities are. And you want to be able to craft your messages and deliver your messages in a way that they can share, or at least they can ingest and digest and then share out with the people that they're in communication with. Whether they're holding court at the local diner, as some folks did before COVID, or whether they're the leader and the admin of that mom group on Facebook. Identifying these people and being strategic in actually connecting with them and building relationships with them as the board is going to be an important part of making sure that as many people as possible know about the great work that you're doing at the library. So we're lucky. I saw Gary's on the call today. I actually got to meet Gary Spielman a couple of years ago when I was taking the Advocacy Day bus home from a Advocacy Day where we were going out there and pounding the pavement of the halls of the LOB and the other Capitol buildings in Albany to to ask for funding for library services. So Gary pointed out, I think this is very astute, and this goes back to some of the stuff that we were saying with turning outward earlier, and is a very important part of being engaged with people in your community, is not just telling them what's going on at the library, but actually listening. And so Gary said a trustee as ambassador is more than representing the library. They are listening and channeling patrons' needs and wants back to library leadership. So when you're out in the community and talking to people, you are listening to see if there's ways that the library can actually help fulfill their needs and have the library actually meet those community needs. The benefits of having this kind of engagement in the community, as I said earlier, will be goodwill often. When I made regular trips to the Chamber of Commerce meeting when I was the director at the Pauling Library, and at one point there was a spontaneous outpouring of how great the library was and how valuable it was and how lucky the community was to have the library and an active library. And that was a really great thing for me, but I was also really happy that they knew that the library was valuable and that they knew it was a resource and that they knew they were willing to cooperate and help them meet their goals. So your library likewise will benefit in terms of people who are volunteering for the library, who are volunteering their time, people who are making donations through campaigns or to the Friends group, or at the ballot box, as Gary points out here. They are on a regular schedule of going out for 414 votes, and he says every 2 years we are judged by the voters in the privacy of the voting booth. The ballot box is the ultimate feedback loop, and we have learned to embrace it. So I thought this was really well put, and this is where it counts, right? Is can your library secure the funding from the community that they can continue to provide the services the community needs? And through their ambassadorship in the Kinderhook Memorial Library, they actually see this come to fruition, and they see this come through their work.
Cool. Thank you so much, Casey. And thank you to Gary, Pat, and Mark for sharing their expertise as board presidents. All three of those libraries have accomplished amazing things. I encourage you to check out the websites of those libraries and learn about those libraries. They're doing amazing work. So we're at our 7th habit of the evening. You have made it to our last habit of the evening, and then we'll wrap up with some of the other questions that came up into the questions box that we've been keeping track of. But the seventh habit that we wanted to put before you is the idea of sustainable thinking, which some of you have heard us talk about in the past, and some of you may know that I actually wrote a whole book on this topic because I think it's so critical to the success of the future of libraries throughout not only our system, but literally the world. To have library boards that are thinking through a sustainable lens. And you know that for years, and now you see Casey's job description actually has the word sustainability in it because we want libraries to be viable for the future. We know how critical they are. And so boards have to have sustainable mindsets to make good decisions for the future, whether it be funding decisions, policy decisions, renovation or expansion of facilities, service design through your planning processes. We want libraries to really be thinking through what we call this lens of the triple bottom line, that we're not just thinking about how much does it cost to do something, but we think about that cost in terms of the financial cost, the environmental cost, and the social cost of the choices that we're making. So at the end of the day, we have libraries that are truly sustainable and are there to thrive for the future, depending, no matter what the disruption is that our communities are faced with, whether it be a local economic disruption, like maybe a massive disruption like a pandemic, or an even bigger disruption like climate change. All of these will have implications for decisions boards make, really even very small decisions that boards make. So learning more about this idea of the triple bottom line and how to use that framework to make good decisions, both inside your organization, from prioritizing staff health and wellness, to creating healthy buildings for your staff and the public to access library services in, to making budget decisions that are going to be stabilizing for your organization to make sure we're spending money wisely in the face of what's coming in the future. And that's something that takes study, right, to understand what will influence the library's budget in the future. We know already that e-resources are rocking the world of libraries and really accelerated rocking the world of libraries during the pandemic, as we saw a 40% increase in people using ebooks and downloadable audiobooks when they weren't able to come into the library. And we're still seeing big increases, even though the doors to library buildings, for the most part, are still open right now during the pandemic. That's going to have a significant impact on budgeting for the future. There's also issues related to broadband and retention of staff. All of these should be decisions that are being made with an eye towards the healthiest possible outcome for the stakeholders of your organization, both those inside the organization, meaning your staff, but also those that you serve, the public. So you might be surprised how much influence you do have as a library board when you're writing policy or making a budgetary decision that decides whether or not you're going to pay a library clerk a living wage or not. It could be the difference between them having food on the table or not. These are very heavy decisions sometimes that we're making, and we want to do so with an eye towards human health and understanding that at the end of the day, if we're not taking care of each other and our neighbors, we really have to question what it's all about and what we're up to. And so at the micro level, making policy decisions about staff in the facility, those should all translate upwards into producing quality library service that truly makes a difference in people's lives. So the slide that you're seeing here is something that I'm currently obsessed with and I've been studying for the past year because I think it's a very interesting way for us to measure the effectiveness of the services we provide as libraries. When we think about the triple bottom line applying to the economic health of a community, the social equitability of the services that we provide, and the environmental stewardship that's necessary for us all to thrive on this planet, that can feel very overwhelming. So how do we break that down and make it doable and find our ways to find paths forward to design library services and programs that truly make a difference in people's lives? Because I think at the end of the day, that's what we're all really in this for, right? Casey and I are here this evening. You gave up some time to be here this evening because you truly believe in the power of libraries to change people's lives. So let's get methodical about that. What are those metrics we're going to use to measure the success of what we're doing? And this is a framework from the city of Santa Monica in California called the Well-Being Project that extrapolates that triple bottom line into 5 categories of focus to measure the well-being of the residents of Santa Monica. And so I think there's a lot perhaps to be translated to library planning for the future as we start to think through these categories. They're definitely scalable for smaller communities communities here in the Mid-Hudson Library System. And I think we can all appreciate the fact that they have the sample measures or metrics that they're using to measure how well we're doing in these areas. So as we start to think about the goals that you set for yourself, once you've achieved that shared vision, let's actually make sure we're doing things that are measurable and making a difference in people's lives. Are we contributing to graduation rates? Are we contributing to student success at school? Are we contributing to healthier places to live and raise families in our community? These are all really big questions that libraries should be a key player in contributing to the success of. Are you the sole organization that has a responsibility for success in these areas? No, but you clearly want to demonstrate the library as a contributor and that you are savvy enough to understand that this is why the library is so important to the community. So when you get your ambassador mindset all into focus and you're raring to go, you're talking about things that really connect and are relevant to the people that you serve. So again, this chart is in your handout packet if you want to take a closer look at it and think about it a little more, but it's something that I know Casey and I are really interested in injecting and embedding into library planning for the coming years. We think there's a clear urgency for libraries to apply library science to be very, very cognizant of the challenges of our communities these days. And they are big, big challenges that are going to take big thinking. And I think libraries have the pleasure and the privilege of doing some of that thinking. So Casey, I know we have some more questions in that chat box and I'm totally ready to answer them, but I just wanted to end with this final message of pointing out that sustainable thinking at the end of the day is about social cohesion. When you've got neighbors in your community that have respect, empathy, and understanding for one another, there's nothing you can't figure out together. And that goes for the work you do together in a small group at the library board table, as well as for the community at large. So focusing on social cohesion is a really special place that the library can play in our communities to, tighten up that social fabric, to make sure people are connected with one another and care about one another. And I bet you can make that case very easily this year of how what the library has focused on has been doing this good work. And I think it's very hard to go wrong when you put that at the center of the decision making for your library for both small and large decisions. So Casey, I saw two questions in there right away, and I bet some more might have come in since we ended. I'm going to acknowledge that we're about a minute out from our end time. So if anyone needs to go, we certainly understand. You're going to get a recording of this after the workshop. So if you miss anything, you'll get to pick it up there. But I want to make sure we answer people's questions this evening before we sign off. And I also want to make sure before you sign off that you hear from Casey and I a big thank you for spending time with us this evening to learn more about what we think are the 7 effective habits for effective libraries. Now, I saw a question in there asking if agendas need to be posted on the library's website. That is certainly optional. You don't have to, but it would be helpful so people know what's going to be spoken about at your library board meeting. I will remind you that open meetings law does require you to provide any documents that are going to be discussed at your meeting to the public who attend your meeting the day of the meeting. So how much of your board packet you decide to put online is certainly a board decision. I'll point out that the Mid-Hudson Library System Board, you can see the full board packet about a week before that board meeting. As I said, we try to model that best practice. So that's something you could go onto our website right now and see our agenda and all related material for the meeting we're having this coming Saturday. Another question that came through was Joe, who clarified his question about committees that he had before. He wasn't asking me how many members of the board should be on the committee. He was asking how many committees a library should have. And I'll say that that can depend on the size of your library to some degree. There's some core committees every library should have related to your executive committee, your finance committee, a personnel committee. Sometimes that's expanded to a planning and personnel committee, perhaps a board development committee. And then there's probably a facilities committee. Now, beyond that, you might have some specialized committees specific to the work that you're doing. So I can't say there's a prescribed number of committees, but it will depend on the work and the focus of your committee, of your board, and the size of your board also. Smaller boards tend to have less committees. That's usually a trend in libraries. So if you need help figuring that out, let us know. So Casey, did anything else come through while I was droning on there?
So I just wanted to acknowledge we had some applause from Laura at the section where we were talking about Mark in the Stanford Library. some virtual applause. We also had somebody comment on the stay in your lane section. They said that this is so important, in all caps, exclamation point. So they very much agreed that it's important for everybody to be staying in their lane with directors and trustees knowing what their roles are. We had a comment that somebody thinks officially swearing in someone or officially welcoming new members is a lovely thing, and a tiny ceremony can mean a lot.
Yeah, so public libraries do have to administer an oath of office legally. Whenever you have a new trustee begin their term, or even a trustee starting a new term has to do that oath of office. But sometimes boards will do a whole ceremony every year to swear everyone in and maybe have everyone sign the code of ethics, kind of in a ceremonial act to remind everyone how special serving the board is. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Okay, and then we also had a comment on the community connections to make sure that you also include non-binary and additional choices under the gender section.
Oh, what a great suggestion. Really thank you to whoever put that in there. That is an area that I think we have a growing level of awareness of, that not everyone identifies as male or female, and being sensitive to that in the forms that we use. The Directors Association of the Mid-Hudson Library System just made an adjustment to the Sierra software to accommodate that, because staff are experiencing that more often than they had in the past, with patrons who come in and are very uncomfortable about that question on the library registration card form. So great practice to extend to that board development form as well. Thank you.
All right, and we had somebody who left for dinner, which I don't
Oh,
blame them.
yeah.
Um, and we had somebody who's going to be up all night thinking of things, and sorry. Happy to talk tomorrow, I guess.
All right,
And
well,
then we have a
cool.
number of thank yous. Yep.
Oh, that's so nice. Wow. Oh, I have, as always, I hope everyone knows the most important thing you should take away from tonight is that Casey and I are here to help you. If you have questions or challenges, we can always connect you with advice from other library boards who have done other challenging things, or we can help you work through an issue that maybe no one's seen before, which certainly does happen now and again. So thanks again for joining us. We hope this was a good use of your time. You'll get a follow-up email from us that has all the resources from this evening, as well as the recording from the event, and also an evaluation form, which we always appreciate your input on. So thank you very much, and have a nice night. I hope you enjoy your dinner if you haven't had it yet.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Casey.